you a fan of Frankenstein's monster? Let me know in the comments down below. What's the difference between both the movies and the monsters? Let's find out. Both movies are based on the novel Frankenstein by the writer Mary Shelley that was published in 1818. Let's take a look at the first movie named Frankenstein from 1931. The movie opens in a graveyard where we see a group of mourners having a funeral for their loved one. Everything looks normal until we see two men very suspiciously watching them from behind a grave as if they were waiting for something. After the mourners leave, their local friendly gravedigger starts to fill the grave. After his hard work is done, he leaves for the night. The two men come out from hiding as soon as he's out of sight. We can see that one of the men has a hunchback and the other one looks fancy. They definitely make for a really odd pair. We see them commit an act of taboo by digging up the newly buried body. Unashamed of the act they just committed, they quickly put the coffin in their pull cart and head over to where a body is hanging from the gallows. After cutting down the body and examining it, the fancy man sees that the neck is broken and decides that the brain is useless, so they have to find another one. At Godstad Medical College, we see a class lecture going on that's about to end for the day. We see the familiar face of the sneaky hunchback man looking through a window into the classroom. The professor is showing his class two jars. One has a normal brain in it, and the other one has a criminal brain in it. He explains to them how the brain structures of each one are different, and finishes up his lecture by dismissing his class. Once everyone's gone, the hunchbacked man opens the window and sneaks into the empty classroom. He hurries up to the professor's desk and steals the normal brain. But just as he was leaving, he gets startled by a loud noise and ends up dropping the jar on the floor. Since the jar shattered and the brain got damaged, they can't use it anymore. So he decides to go with the next best thing and grabs the jar with the criminal brain in it and takes it with him. We're taken to a fancy house where we meet Elizabeth and her friend Victor. During their interaction, we learn that Elizabeth is engaged to a man named Henry, and that she hasn't heard from him in 4 months until now in a letter. We also learn that his work and experiments are very important to him, even more important than she is. He tells her that he's living in an old watchtower with his assistant, away from nosy people, so that he can work in peace and secret. He tells her to have faith in him, and just to be patient and wait for him to come back. She does believe in him, but she's still very worried about him, so she goes with Victor to visit his old medical school professor, Dr. Waldman, to see if he could shed some light on the situation with Henry. Talking to the professor doesn't really do much to ease her worries. If anything, it makes her worry more about him. The professor tells them that Frankenstein is a very smart young man, but that he's erratic and that he worries him. Elizabeth asks him why Henry left the university if he was doing fine before and seemed happy with his work. He tells her that his theories were becoming dangerous and that he's changed due to his work and his insane ambition to create life. He goes on to say that he asked for more bodies, but the university thought it was unreasonable, so he left the university to work on his experiments uninterrupted. And it looks like he ended up finding what he needed somewhere else. They ask if they can go visit him, but he warns them that he won't welcome them. If anything, he'll just be annoyed at them for interrupting him. She says she doesn't care, she just wants to see him, and asks the doctor if he'll go with them since Henry respects him, and he accepts to tag along. Meanwhile, Henry is in his lab making preparations. It's here that we learn that the hunchbacked man's name is Fritz. We can see them rushing around the lab getting things ready and running checks and tests on the equipment. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupts them, but they won't let the people inside at first. But when he realizes it's Elizabeth, he lets them in because of the storm outside. He tells them to leave, but they refuse, so he takes them up to his lab and shows them his experiment. He tells the professor that he learned a lot from him, but that he was wrong about ultraviolet light being the strongest in the spectrum, and tells him that he found the ray of light that gave life to all things. He tells them that he's going to use it to give life to a human being that he made himself out of body parts that he was able to get from anywhere he could. He raises his creation to the lightning, and after several good zaps, it comes back down, but now it's moving and alive. Henry's so excited that he can't contain himself and starts laughing and saying that he knows what it feels like to be God. The next day we see Victor and Elizabeth talking to Henry's father, telling him that Henry will be back in a couple of days. But he doesn't believe them and thinks that maybe his son is cheating on Elizabeth, but she tells him that that's not the case. He's just finishing up some important experiments. But his father's still not convinced he's not cheating, so he decides to go and bring his son back to the village. Back at his lab, Henry's talking with the professor, and the professor tells him that the creature will be dangerous. He brushes off his comment and tells him that his brain just needs time to develop, and that it's a perfectly good brain since he got it from the professor's lab. The professor hits him with a bombshell and tells him that the brain that was stolen from his lab was a criminal brain. Henry looks a bit worried now, but brushes off that new development by telling him that it'll be fine since the brain is only dead tissue anyway, but the professor insists that only evil will come of it, and he warns him that he's created a monster and that it will destroy him. But he tells him that he believes in his monster, and if he doesn't, then he should just leave him alone. He says he has to experiment further even though he's only a few days old. He tells him so far he's been kept in complete darkness, but that he'll bring him into the light. Next we hear the monster approaching slowly and walk into the room with a blank stare. Henry instructs him to come in and sit down, and the monster does it. He tells the professor that he understands some things. He opens up the window above to let in the light. That causes the monster to stand up and reach up towards the light, trying to grab it. Once they close the window, the monster lowers his arms, not sure where the light went. Henry instructs him to sit back down, so he does. Suddenly his assistant Fritz runs into the room with a torch and runs up to the monster. The monster's afraid of the fire, and Henry tells him to get away from him with the torch. But he doesn't listen and keeps taunting him with it, so the monster starts to try to attack Fritz. Henry and the professor try to hold him back, but he's too strong, so they hit him in the back of the head, and he falls to the ground, so they tie him up with a rope and take him to the cellar. They chain him up in the cellar, and he's very upset and distressed by it, so he's yelling and making noise. Suddenly we see Fritz entering the room and yelling at him to be quiet. Since he's not quieting down, he begins to beat him with a whip. Henry runs in and tells him to stop doing that, and that he needs to stay back because the monster has the strength of 10 men. He tells Fritz to leave him alone, but Fritz doesn't listen, and continues to torment the monster with a torch, causing the monster even more distress. A little while later, we hear Fritz screaming and find out that he's been killed by the monster, and that the monster's broken out of his chains. Henry isn't really all that surprised about it though, because the monster hated Fritz for tormenting him. I mean, it's like the saying goes, if you mess with the bull, you can't be surprised when you get the horns. They manage to keep him from escaping the cellar and make the decision to kill him, so they rush to get a hypodermic needle before he breaks through the door. They get the needle ready and open the door to let him out, and while he's distracted with Henry, the professor injects him with the needle in his back. After a couple minutes, the monster's down, but there's a frantic knocking on the door, so they open the door to see that it's Victor, and he tells them that Elizabeth and his father are coming up the hill to see him. Henry tells him to keep him out, but Victor tells him it's too late for that. The professor tells Victor to help them move the monster's body so that they won't see it, so they move it into the cellar. A few minutes later, Elizabeth and his father arrive and knock on the door, and they're let in by Victor. They both go up the stairs to see Henry, but he faints after a couple of minutes, so they ask Victor and the professor to help them lie him down on a sofa, and his father and Elizabeth tell him that they're taking him home. Henry tells them that he can't leave his experiment, but the professor tells him not to worry, that he'll make sure that it's painlessly destroyed. Later we see the professor writing notes and preparing to dissect the monster, but just as he's about to begin, the monster wakes up and kills him and escapes to the outside. We see the villagers are all celebrating the coming wedding of Henry and Elizabeth. During that time, we see the monster approach a little girl who invites him to play with her next to the edge of a lake. Things go well at first, as she gives him flowers and shows him how, if he throws the flowers into the lake, that they'll float. He runs out of flowers, so he picks up the little girl and throws her into the water, thinking that she would float too. But when he sees that she didn't float, he panics. He's not sure what to do, so he runs away. The villagers continue celebrating and waiting for the wedding to begin, but before the wedding starts, Elizabeth tells Henry that she feels like something bad is going to happen and that she's worried, but he tells her that she's just nervous and that everything is going to be alright. Victor comes rushing into the room and tells them that the professor's been murdered and that the monster's on the loose. Henry locks Elizabeth in her room to protect her, and suddenly we hear the monster is in the house, so they go look for him. Elizabeth is in her room pacing around, and we see the monster looking at her through a window. He pushes the window open and gets inside, but Elizabeth doesn't notice him, since it's so noisy outside and her back is turned to the window. He starts making groaning sounds, and she notices him and tries to get away, but the door is locked, so she screams and they come rushing to her door and hear a window break before they can enter. When they finally enter, they see Elizabeth is fainted on the bed and the monster is gone. Outside, we see a man carrying his daughter's body in his arms. She's the girl the monster ended up drowning. He's on his way to see the mayor with a group of angry villagers, and they ask the mayor to catch the culprit, so they split up into 3 groups to catch the monster. He tells them to catch him alive if they can, but if they can't, that they should at least just make sure to get him. The men go on the hunt and end up finding him, but the monster knocks out Henry and takes him with him to a windmill. The villagers try to break in to save him, but they can't get the door to budge. Henry tries to escape, but the monster throws him off the top of the windmill, and he lands on one of the wooden blades before he hits the ground. So they take him back to the village to treat his injuries. The villagers decide to set the windmill on fire while the monster is still inside. The monster freaks out and is very afraid, but unfortunately for him, he gets pinned under some fallen debris and gets burned alive. Henry is alive and getting nursed back to health by Elizabeth, and that's how the movie ends. Now let's get into the second movie, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1994. We begin on a ship somewhere in the Arctic Sea in the year 1794. The captain of the ship is obsessed with reaching the North Pole at any cost. The sea is rough and it makes their ship crash into an iceberg, resulting in the ship getting stuck between 2 icebergs. As the captain has his men trying to break the ship free from the ice, they hear a loud moan like the kind a ghost makes. They see a figure appear in the distance walking towards them. As the figure gets closer, they realize it's a man, and once he reaches them, he lowers his hood and asks who the captain is. The captain speaks up and asks him who he is, but the man tells him that there's no time to talk and tells him to bring his weapons and his men, and to come with him right away. But just as the men are about to follow him, the captain tells them not to, because he's not the one who gives the orders. They hear the loud ghostly moan again and are frightened, so the captain orders them all to get back on the ship. The captain takes the stranger into his quarters and questions him about where he came from and what the thing outside is. He tells the stranger that he spent 6 years planning his trip and spent his whole fortune on it, and tells him that no one will stop him from achieving his goal, not him and not even the phantom outside. He looks into the captain's eyes and asks him if he shares his madness. He says that it's not madness, he just wants to find the passage to the North Pole and he's determined to find it. He asks him if he plans to do that at the cost of his own life and the lives of his men, and he tells him yes, because lives come and go, but if they achieve his goal, all their names will live on forever and he'll be celebrated as a big contributor to our species. The stranger tells him that he's wrong, because of all people, he knows that all too well. The captain asks him what his name is, and this time he tells him that his name is Victor Frankenstein. He begins his tale in Geneva in the year 1773. That was the year that his father brought home a little girl around his age, named Elizabeth, that lost her parents. His parents told him to think of her as his sister and to look after her and to always be kind to her. As the years went by, their bond grew. His mom was pregnant and it was finally the day for the baby to be born. Their father was ready to deliver the baby, but unfortunately there was a complication and the baby was not in the right position. Their father had a hard decision to make and he knew he couldn't save them both. So his wife pleaded to him to save their baby. So he honored her wishes and saved the life of their baby boy. He did everything he could, but he couldn't save her, and she ended up dying. Everyone was devastated at the loss, but Victor took it harder than anyone else. He became obsessed with the idea that he could stop death. He wanted to become a doctor so that he could help people and hopefully find the cure for death. After several years, he leaves to go to medical school in Ingolstadt in the year 1793. But before he leaves, he tells Elizabeth that he loves her and wants to marry her. She confesses her feelings for him too and agrees to marry him when he gets back from university, and reminds him that she'll be waiting for him. When he gets to Ingolstadt, he rents out an attic space that's pretty big since he wants to have room for his experiments and equipment. On his first day of class, he's quickly disillusioned about what higher education in the medical field would be like. At this school, they're being taught that they aren't there to think for themselves, they're there to learn to think for their patients, and that they have to submit to the laws of physical reality and are discouraged from exploring anything other than already hard-proven science. After class, a man named Henry introduces himself to Victor, and they become fast friends. During class, Victor notices one of the professors and asks Henry who he is, and he tells him that his name is Professor Waldman, and that the rumor is that when he was younger, he was a science genius, but that he ran into some trouble with authorities some years ago because of some illegal experiments he was conducting. Victor is intrigued and curious about that professor, and it seems that the curiosity is mutual. During a lecture, he argues with another professor about death not being absolute, but the professor tells him that what he's saying is not only illegal, it's immoral. Professor Waldman talks to Victor after class, and Victor tells him that the reason he went to study at the university in the first place was to learn all about the new sciences and to combine modern science with ancient knowledge to make new discoveries, but that unfortunately it's not something they teach there. Professor Walden, maybe sensing a kindred spirit in him, decides to take him to his house and shows him and Henry his experiments. Once in his lab, he shows them how he used Chinese acupuncture to apply electricity to certain parts of a monkey's arm by using the acupuncture needles as conductors for the electricity to make it move and send the electrical signals where he wants them to go. Victor's amazed and asks the professor to let him help him, and the professor accepts but tells him not to tell anyone. As they're eating together, Victor tells the professor and Henry that the best way to cheat death would be to create life. Henry tells him that he's going too far because only God can give life, but Victor tells him to leave God out of it. He gives him a scenario asking him what if someone he loved had a sick heart, wouldn't he want to give them a new one? Henry just says it's impossible, but Victor tells him it's not that far off for them to do. He goes on to say that if they could replace one body part, maybe they can replace every body part, and if they can do that, then they could basically design a life. He tells them that they could possibly even make better humans. Suddenly, the professor speaks up and tells him no. Victor looks at him surprised and asks him how close he got, and he tells him that he got too close. Victor begs him to see his research notes, but he tells him no, that his work is only to be used to preserve life. He tells him that he abandoned that research years ago because it resulted in an abomination. The next day, all the students and Professor Waldman are vaccinating all the citizens of the town against smallpox, but some of the townspeople are ignorant about how vaccines work and don't trust doctors. Professor Waldman, unfortunately, ended up with a patient like that. He refused to get vaccinated, and so the man stabbed him, which resulted in him dying from his wound. The death of his mentor reopened old wounds for Victor about his mother's death. The police caught the man who murdered him and gave him a public execution, which was death by hanging. Later that night, Victor breaks into the late Professor Waldman's lab to steal his research notes about his experiments. He sees where the professor went wrong and thinks that he can work it out and do it better. This is where his obsession really took off. The first body he took for his raw materials was the body of the guy that was hanged. Victor tries to get Henry to help him by telling him that they owe it to Waldman to finish his work, but Henry reminds him that he never wanted that because he abandoned it for a reason. Victor isn't listening though and tries to rationalize it by saying that it's not true, he just couldn't face it and that there's a difference. Henry tells him that even if it were possible, there's probably a terrible price to pay, but Victor doesn't care and tells him that any price is worth paying. Henry won't help him, so he does it alone. Victor starts to work on the first body right away. Back in Geneva, we see Elizabeth is very upset because Victor hasn't written back to her in months. She's worried about him because she's heard about a cholera outbreak in the town he's living in. Frankenstein tells her that she should just go to him, so she goes to see him. Meanwhile, we see Victor in a graveyard trying to break into a mausoleum to steal his mentor's brain. Next, he pays a guy to allow him to take parts from men who died of cholera. He needs a special ingredient, which happens to be amniotic fluid, so he pays midwives for buckets of it. He decides to test out his new method for giving life, so he uses a dead toad, and it works. But he doesn't see how easily the toad kicked the glass he was in and broke it. He finishes putting all the pieces together to form a man, and prepares the body for the reanimation process. The next day, he's woken up by a knock at his door from Henry, who tells him that the cholera is now an epidemic, and that the town is being quarantined, so that he should leave now while he still can, but he refuses and tells Henry goodbye. The next voice he hears is Elizabeth's, and he lets her in. She's upset at how he's living and tells him that they have to leave because it isn't safe due to the epidemic. But he tells her no, he needs to stay, and then she asks him even if it means he might die, and he tells her yes. So she tells him if he's going to stay, he should let her help him, but he refuses and tells her to leave. She reminds him that they made a promise, but he tells her he can't leave his work, it's just too important, and that it has to come first even before their relationship. Pains him to say those words to her, but he knows he needed to say them, and with tear-filled eyes, she says goodbye to him and runs out into the crowd of people. With pain in his heart and a renewed purpose, he throws himself back into his work and begins the reanimation process. It worked and his creation came to life, but it accidentally got caught up in some chains and ended up dying. Victor realizes that what he did is wrong and decides to destroy all his notes so no one else can try what he did, but for now he puts his journal in his coat pocket and goes to sleep. After a few hours, Victor hears noises coming from the lab and sees his monster is actually alive and was able to free himself from the chains. Ironically, Victor is afraid of him and runs out to go find an axe to kill it with, but he's gone before he gets back into the room. Naked and afraid, the monster runs away, but grabs Victor's coat on his way out to cover himself. The monster starts to walk around the spots of vendors selling bread, and tries to take one, but the lady pushes him away because he's technically stealing it. The man grabs him and yanks down his hood, and the lady screams. The monster's first reaction isn't to hurt any of the people. He was just afraid, so he tried to run away, but they cornered him, and he felt he had to protect himself, so he did. He was able to create an opening for himself and managed to escape by hiding among the dead bodies that were getting pulled on a cart heading out of town. When the cart was out of town, he quickly jumped off and headed into the woods. Meanwhile, Victor is laying in bed being treated by Henry for pneumonia. He asks Henry about the epidemic and he tells him that it's horrible, but that sadly there's nothing they could do to help them. All the vulnerable and those without food or shelter, and especially all the newborns, will die. Victor asks him if he's sure, and he tells him yes. Henry says he has to go and tells him he'll see him later. After he leaves, Victor hears someone playing the piano in the next room, so he gets up to see who it is and is overjoyed to see it's Elizabeth. They run into each other's arms and hug and kiss like they haven't seen each other in years. He begs her to forgive him, and she does. She tells him that she doesn't know what he was working on, and she doesn't want to know, but she's upset that it nearly killed him. He tells her that she doesn't have to worry about that anymore because it's over and done with, and that he should have never started it in the first place, and tells her that it's dead, and she doesn't understand what he's talking about, but she's just happy it's over. We catch up with the monster walking through the woods. He suddenly stops when he hears someone playing the flute. He decides to go towards the sound and comes to a little house and decides to hide in the little bar. A man goes in to feed the pigs and doesn't notice him. So as soon as he leaves, the monster eats some of the scraps out of the pig's trough. The monster peeks through the wood planks and watches the family. There's 3 adults and 2 children. The parents of the kids, a little girl and boy, and their grandpa, who appears to be blind. The monster sits down and finds Victor's journal in his pocket, and flips through it, but doesn't understand it. As he watches the family struggle to collect their harvest since the ground is too hard and frozen, he decides to help them out, so when they fell asleep, he went out and harvested all their crops for them. The family was overjoyed and wondered who did that for them. Their grandpa tells them that it was probably the good spirit of the woods, and the kids think so too. Back in Ingolstadt, we see that Victor is packing everything up and getting ready to return to Geneva to take over his father's practice and expand it. We also learn that Elizabeth and Victor are now engaged. Henry is happy for them, and Victor tells him that his practice is going to need a partner and asks Henry to be his partner and to come live with them in Geneva, and he accepts. As things are looking up for Victor, they seem to be looking up for the monster a bit too. At Christmas time, the children left a snack outside to thank the good spirit of the forest. The monster was happy to see this and felt appreciative of their act of kindness. The next day, their landlord shows up looking for the father in order to collect his rent money. The wicked and vile man threatens the little girl, but the grandpa comes out and tells him to leave her alone, so he attacks the grandpa. The little girl runs to her parents and tells them that a man attacked her grandpa, so they rush back. The monster is protective of the family and gets angry and kills the man. The old man thanks him for saving him and tells him to come inside and sit with him by the fire. He tells him that he's glad he finally came out of the shadows and asks him why he hides. He tells them it's because people are afraid when they see him. The old man tells him that he can see him with his hands if he'll let him, so he does, and as he touches his face, he tells him that he's very sorry for whatever happened to him that left him so disfigured. He asks him if he has any friends or family, and he tells him that there are some people, but that they don't know him. He grabs his hand and asks him why he doesn't go to them, and he tells them that it's because he's very ugly and they're very beautiful. The rest of the family returns to the house, and the father rushes in and starts hitting the monster and telling him to get out. But the old man keeps telling him to leave him alone, but he isn't listening to him. The monster runs out sad and heartbroken and starts crying under a tree. He tries to go back and talk to the family to show them that he means no harm, but by the time he gets back there, they've already left. He's upset and decides to read Victor's journal and realizes that he was the result of an experiment and is horrified to find out the truth of his existence and how he came to be. He pledges to get revenge on Victor and heads to Geneva to find him. Meanwhile, we see Elizabeth arriving at their house in Geneva, and their family comes out front to welcome her, and she shows him the locket that Victor gave her as an engagement ring substitute. Their little brother William takes the locket to go show his friend, but on his way there, he heard the sound of a flute. He followed the sound and saw the monster, but as soon as he saw him, he screamed and dropped the locket and ran away. A little later, their father's rushing around looking for William because it's already late and he hasn't come back yet, and his friend said he never arrived to his house. Everyone forms a search party to look for him, and eventually they find him later that night. But unfortunately, he's dead. Everyone is upset, and Justine's mom is worried about her because she's still out looking for William and hasn't returned yet. Victor agrees to help find her daughter, but before they could even begin to search, there's a knock at the door. The police are at the door, and they say they found the woman responsible for the murder hiding in a barn and that she had the locket with her. He tells him that he needs to come right away because the townspeople are forming a lynch mob. When they get there, they see that the townspeople have broken into the jailhouse and are taking Justine to the gallows. Victor, Elizabeth, and her mother can't reach her or help her in any way, so they're forced to watch in horror as the mob ties the noose around her neck and hangs her. That night, they retrieve her body so that they can give her a proper burial. On his way back to his house, Victor stopped by his monster, who tells him that he'll meet him on the Sea of Ice, and points to the mountains, and walks away after delivering his message. Victor's stunned because he thought the monster had died. The next day, Victor sets out with his gun to go meet his monster, but Henry and Elizabeth tell him not to go and don't understand what's happening, but he says that he must go and that he will tell them all about it when he destroys him. He finally meets his monster, and he's surprised that he really does know how to talk. And the monster tells him that he can do more than just talk. He can also read and think. And Victor asks him how he found him, and he told him that it was because of his journal. Victor looks at him sadly and asks him if he's going to kill him, and he says no. He asks him if he's the one that killed his little brother, and he said yes. He told him that when he killed him, he saw his face. He tells him that he's the one who made him and gave him emotions, but never told him how to use them. He tells him that now 2 people died because of them. He asks him why he did it, and he tells him that he doesn't know. It was just something in his soul that made him do it. He asks Victor if he has a soul or if that's something he left out. He asks him who the people he was made of are. Are they good people or bad people? But he can't really answer, and all he tells him is that they were raw materials and nothing more. But the monster tells him that he's wrong and shows him a flute and tells him, "Did you know I know how to play this? But from which part of me did that knowledge come from?" He tells him that reading and speaking wasn't something he learned, but more like something he just remembered. He asks Victor if he ever considered the consequences of his actions, because he gave him life and then left him to die. He asks him who he is, and he tells him that he doesn't know, and asks him if he thinks he's evil. And he doesn't answer the question, he just responds by saying, "What can he do?" The monster tells him that there's something that he wants. He tells him that he wants a female that will be his companion, that's like him so she won't hate him. Victor tells him that he doesn't know what he's asking, but he tells him that he does. He knows that with the sympathy of one living being, He would make peace with everything that happened. He tells Victor that he has so much love inside that he can't imagine, but he also has so much rage inside that he wouldn't be able to believe it, and tells him if he can't fulfill his desire for love, then he'll give in to his desire to destroy. Victor considers things for a moment and asks him if he does that for him, how he'll live. He tells him that he and his bride will travel north to the furthest reaches of the pole, where no man has ever set foot, and they would live out their lives there together and no humans would ever see them again. He vows that he'll do that if he helps him. Victor tells him that in order to right his wrong that he'll do it. When he gets back to the house, he gets in a fight with Elizabeth, so she decides to leave and starts packing her things. In the meantime, Victor is getting his lab set up and the monster brings him the body of Justine. He asks him why her, but he tells him it's just raw materials, nothing more, just like you said. He refuses to do it and tells him that he can just kill him, but he tells him he has to keep his promise to him and that death is mild compared to what he can do to him. He warns him that if he denies him his wedding night, then he'll be with him on his. Victor rushes downstairs to stop Elizabeth from leaving, and she agrees to stay if he agrees to marry her that day. He accepts her terms, and a few hours later, they're finally married. After the wedding, they try to leave Geneva, but all the fairies are gone, so they are forced to stay and find a place to stay for the night, and he has his men guarding them. The newlyweds are starting their wedding night, but suddenly Victor hears the sound of a flute. He stops what he's doing and rushes outside to try to help his men kill the monster. His wife is left alone in the room now, so the monster breaks in and kills Elizabeth by ripping her heart out of her body with his bare hands. And then rolls her off the bed. Victor is devastated and horrified. In desperation, he rushes back to their house to bring her back to life. But Henry tells him not to do it and just leave her in peace. But he tells him that his father would have done the same for his mom if he could have. But Henry tells him that his father's dead. Victor tells him that he loves her and wants her back. Henry protests, but he ignores him and goes to his lab to bring her back. Since her heart is gone, he puts Elizabeth's head onto Justine's body and starts the reanimation process. Once she's alive, he tries to get her to remember him, but she's having trouble remembering. The monster comes for her, but he tells him that she's not for him, but he calls her and she goes to him. She notices all the stitches on him and notices that she has stitches too, and feels all over her face and feels more stitches. Suddenly, an expression of horror and realization crosses her face. Victor and the monster start fighting over her, but she's not having it, and doesn't want to live that way, so she grabs a lantern and lights herself on fire, and runs throughout the house until she runs off the second-story staircase and plummets onto the ground below, and finally dies. Victor tells the captain of the ship that he's been following the trail the monster left for him for months, heading north with the intention of killing him, but he tells him that he's really tired, and dies after telling his story. The captain goes up to the deck and his men ask him what he said, and he tells them that he died raving about some phantom. His second in command asks him what's out there, and he tells him that he told them a story that couldn't be true, and says that he thinks that he was just crazy. They notice that there's a warm breeze, and the captain says the ice might end up melting soon. The second then asks him what happens after that, and he tells them that they'll keep heading north, and the second says no. But suddenly they're interrupted by a loud sound coming from the captain's quarters, and they see the monster sitting there next to Victor's body crying. The captain asks him who he is, and he tells him that he never gave him a name. He asks him why he's crying, and he tells him because he was his father. The men build a pyre and place Victor's body and journal on it, and douse it in kerosene, but before they can light it, the ice starts to break up and they all rush to get back to the ship, except for the monster. The captain invites him to go with them, but he refuses and says he's done with man. The monster instead grabs the torch and swims to the pyre and lights it and himself on fire, as the men on the ship watch in disbelief. The second asks him, "Where to now, Captain?" and he finally tells him, "Home." Did you feel any empathy for the monsters in both movies? In the first movie, Henry created his monster just because he wanted to see if he could, and a big part of that reason was to mainly feed his ego and curiosity. He wasn't afraid of his monster at first. He wanted to learn what he could from it and teach it things. Things went sideways pretty quickly, but honestly I blame his assistant Fritz for that because he treated the monster badly for no reason. I think if Fritz treated the monster better, that the outcome would have been better. Also, if the monster had the normal brain, it maybe would have helped him. In the second movie, Victor had a more deep personal reason to create his monster, but a big part of it was his curiosity and his ambition to beat death. He was warned by his mentor not to do it, but he didn't listen to him. Instead, he took advantage of his death by stealing his research notes, and later he disrespected him even more by literally stealing his brain. Victor was at first glad that his monster was alive, but after he thought the monster died, he was ashamed of what he did. After he saw that the monster was actually still alive, he was afraid of him and tried to kill him. He didn't give him a chance and never considered that maybe the monster was afraid too. It's such a shame because I think if he would have helped him, so many deaths could have been prevented and he wouldn't have felt so alone and lost. In my opinion, both of the monster's creators were jerks. The first for not protecting his monster from Fritz, and the second for not even trying to help his monster after he saw it was still alive. Both monsters have enhanced physical strength and are made up of lots of body parts from different cadavers. The monster from the classic version has the brain of a criminal and demonstrated a little bit of intelligence, but didn't have very much understanding of the world around him, or even the ability to speak. He did show some emotions, but more basic surface level emotions. The more modern version of the monster was more aware of the world and how people viewed him. He had the brain of Victor's mentor, so he was smart and empathetic and tried to help some people. He also could read, speak, think, and play the flute. He had stronger, more complex emotions also. I like the creature design of the classic Frankenstein's monster because the look is so iconic. For its time, the makeup and prosthetics look great. It took the makeup artist at least 4 hours to apply his makeup and 2 hours to remove it. I give this design a rating of 9 creature claws out of 10. The creature design for the more modern version of the monster took inspiration from medical techniques of the time period where the movie takes place. The makeup in the film was unique and required the actor to wear a full-body prosthetic skin that was flexible. It would take the makeup team 12 hours to apply all of the makeup. That gave it more of a grotesque look and made it look more realistic. I give his design 8 creature claws out of 10. If you like this video, smack that subscribe button and watch this video next. If you want to watch the videos I mentioned in this video, the links are in the description box below. This has been the Creature Junkie, your home for all things monster and creature related. See you in my next video.